The Killer Inside, the Ruth Finley Story on Lifetime is a movie based on the mysterious true story of Ruth Finley, a woman who led police on a 4-year chase to find a crazed stalker named the Poet, who allegedly sent her letters, abducted her, and severely injured her during her kidnapping. Now, this story goes back to 1981, when the 51-year-old housewife and secretary confessed to stalking herself and was placed under psychiatric care. Doctors believed she had made the whole story up, stemming from a traumatic event she had with a neighbor at the age of 3. So Ruth's story made headlines around 1980 when police first released a composite photo of the Poet. Now, Ruth first reported the threatening letters and phone calls in 1978. Even more bizarre, this all unfolded during the BTK Killer's reign of terror. So, for a while, they thought the two cases were connected. The Killer Inside, the Ruth Finley Story on Lifetime. Let's talk about the plot. So we're in Wichita, Kansas, and the year is 1977. A mother prepares dinner while her child opens the door to a man identifying himself as a detective. So the man steps inside the house, places the little boy in the bathroom, and ends the mother's life. Now, that scene in the movie is inspired by the murder of Shirley Vian, a woman who was ended after her 5-year-old son opened the door to who would be later known as the BTK Killer. That happened on March 17, 1977. Everybody around town is keeping up with this case, even Ruth. Ruth is cooking at the same time she's listening to these news stories, and her family, in the movie consists of her husband, Ed, and her mother, who is living with them. They think that she's into true crime too much. She's really focused on this case, and they want her to kind of, just enjoy her life and not be so much into this case. Now, they seem to have a happy life at home, but their blissful domestic life takes a downturn when Ed suffers a heart attack in the backyard. Luckily for Ed, he survives and is stable, but he has to stay in the hospital until the doctors can determine why this happened to him. Meanwhile, Ruth returns to her home, and she's alone at this time. Now, I think I said earlier that her mother lived with her. I don't believe she actually lived with her. I think she just visited a lot. So at this particular time, Ed is in the hospital. I guess the mother is at home, and Ruth is there by herself, and she is mortified. There is a killer out there. The police have not made an arrest. And she doesn't know it yet, but the fear of losing Ed is going to shake up her world in a way she never imagined. Now, in another scene, we see Ruth, and she's relaxing, and she's taking a bath. And it's the first time we see some scars. There are some strange scars on her leg. And then she reflects back to what happened to her many years earlier when she was attacked by a would-be killer. This killer, almost killer, bound her and branded her with an iron. So she almost lost her life in that attack. And it's something that she has really tried to forget about over the years, but every now and then she does remember what happened to her. Just as she's recalling that traumatic event, she is spooked even more by a mysterious phone call. The caller tells her that he remembers that night. Well, what is that night? He's talking about the night that she was attacked by this stranger. So how does this man even know what happened to her? So she's really, really spooked by the entire call. And those fears are confirmed when she is grabbed by a man on the street. So she informs the police. She tells them that someone grabbed her while she was walking down the street, and she tells them about these very strange letters. Now, detectives, as they look at the case, they start to believe that this is connected to the BTK killer because he also leaves letters, taunting letters. She gives them a description of the assailant. Meanwhile, the letters keep showing up in her mailbox. So we're talking about The Killer Inside, the Ruth Finley Story on Lifetime. Now, Ed is worried. There is something off about Ruth. Not only is she receiving these letters, she's also receiving menacing phone calls. So the letters have now escalated to strange calls. The person is calling her at work. Between the scenes, there is a man who watches the house in the distance. And when you see this man appear in the movie, that's when he's about to make his next attack. Right after we hear that another woman named Nancy has been murdered in her home by none other than the BTK Killer, the community is just living in fear still. They are just stuck in fear, wondering who this person is. Now, that scene was inspired by the real woman, Nancy Fox, who died in her home in December of 1979. Okay, so the entire community is obsessed with this killer. And I believe Nancy Fox was the killer's 8th victim. And that's what they said in the movie. But Ruth is about to have another traumatic event in her life. She is kidnapped off the street, dragged into the back seat of a car, and taken off into the woods. Her husband gets a notification that Ruth did not show up to work. And so he contacts police and they're looking for her. Meanwhile, Ruth escapes from these kidnappers and she shows up at a gas station where she is rescued. The new detective takes over the case because before the new detective showed up, there was another cop who was helping her, but he seemed like he had gotten really close to the family and he wasn't really able to see the clues and the signs. But this new detective senses something very strange about Ruth and her story. Now, Ruth describes the man as best she can. The investigator has a sketch artist make a composite of the perpetrator, and they publish it in the local newspaper. Now, close by, the BTK Killer continues to strike again. So, of course, Ruth is at home. She's under protection. They tell her not to leave, but she is feeling like a prisoner in her own home. She doesn't want to live in fear, and so she ignores their warnings, and she leaves. She leaves and she goes to the mall, but this time she is grabbed again. And it's a little different this time because she is physically hurt in this attack. Now, just above Ruth, while she's getting physically assaulted by this person, the camera above them is recording and capturing this entire event. So Ruth, the scene switches over and Ruth is at the hospital. She's lucky to be alive. She had to have surgery because he really hurt her. But Ruth is okay and she recovers at home. Now, this is where the movie really starts to get interesting. The killer inside, the Ruth Finley story. So one night, she's home in bed with her husband, Ed. They're asleep peacefully, and Ruth wakes up, grabs a match, and sets the bushes on fire outside her home. And then she acts like she didn't know what happened. And at this point in the movie, Lifetime viewers sense that Ruth might have a mental health issue. Officers are sent to the home once again. They put patrol cars in the area so that she can have around-the-clock surveillance. But they have a problem. No one has any real evidence to show that she's ever been attacked. There is no proof that anything happened. There are no footprints. There are no instruments of danger. They live on a dead-end street. No neighbors have ever reported anything, so nothing is adding up. Now, detectives put the clues together, and this new detective thinks it's Ed. He accuses Ed, but after investigating him, they realize it's not him, it's her. Now, can you believe this? It's Ruth. Ruth is the one who is stalking herself. Now, they need proof. They need more proof. So they tell Ed to get her out of the house. And when they get inside the house, police strike gold. All of the evidence points to Ruth. And, they get the footage from the attack in the parking lot and they show Ruth the footage. Because when they first accused her, she said, this isn't true, that it's not me. I mean, she was so convincing. Terry Hatcher really played this part really well. I really enjoyed the way she did this. And she was shocked. But when they showed her the footage and she saw that she was fighting with herself and had injured herself, she couldn't believe it. The look on her face was just total defeat. And then her only answer was that she just has to be crazy, that she doesn't have any other explanation. But she looked really defeated in that moment to find out that she was the one doing this. So she wasn't just a bored housewife. Something is really wrong with her. And so they take her into custody and they place her into psychiatric care, where she is encouraged to write out her feelings. Doctors end up diagnosing her with multiple personality disorder. At first, that was what they said at first. And the doctor said that she had a normal childhood, but they believed that something traumatic happened to her that she didn't remember. And so during the session, they uncovered that memory. She remembered being a little girl when a neighbor next door used to come by and play a little game, right? He wore a red scarf around his neck. So they believe that what he did traumatized her for life. And I'm not going into the details of that, but I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about there. And so she was so upset, she somehow buried that memory and created these personalities. So she confesses to writing the letter. She confesses to making the phone calls. And the police dropped the charges. In the end, the doctors believed, let me say that again. The doctors believed she had dissociative identity disorder. And her fear of losing Ed is what triggered that. So the end of the movie, Ed stays with her. He supports her to the, until the end. And really, he's the total definition of, staying married in sickness and in health, because most men would have left. Now, in real life, Ruth Finley told her story on many talk shows, including the Oprah Winfrey Show. And Ruth died in 2019 at the age of 89. Her husband stayed with her until he passed away years earlier. I think it was 2011. I thought it was a good movie. I thought it was an interesting one. It's not the first time I've heard of a case where a person stalked themselves. Many of you Lifetime viewers, I'm sure you remember other movies that were based on true stories like that. And if you've ever dealt with anyone like that in real life, you know that these things happen. You know how real and how scary that can be. So I think you will at least enjoy learning about her story. The Killer Inside, the Ruth Finley Story, airs June 29th at 8/7 Central on Lifetime.